Welcome back. This is The Ben Shapiro Show. The Ben Shapiro Show is sponsored by ExpressVPN. For peace of mind, whenever you go online, visit expressivpn.com/Ben. Alrighty, in breaking news, Twitter has apparently locked the account of Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. They've locked her account. Democrats are preparing a resolution to expel her from the United States Congress, and they locked her Twitter account, which is pretty impressive coordination between our social media tech bros and the Democrats in Congress, almost as though it is completely coordinated at every level. And you can see this in virtually every story. You can see this every day. Do not trust the tech bros. Do not trust the hand-in-glove relationship between the Democrats and their friends in social media and in the establishment media more generally. Which brings us, by the way, to the relationship between the Biden administration and the media. So Joe Biden is clearly in decline. I mean, I honestly feel bad making fun of Biden at this point. I've gotten to that point. So for a little while, I was kind of okay with it. And now I feel bad for the guy. Like, he's obviously in decline. And the media are pretending that he's not. And they're pretending that you're wrong for noticing that he is in decline. Even though it's kind of not a great thing that the president of the United States is not aware of the things that are going on around him. I mean, certainly other countries are taking advantage of this. I mean, Russia is pretty obviously getting aggressive. China is getting very aggressive. There's a little tete-a-tete between the Chinese ambassador and the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, over the last couple of days, in which the Chinese ambassador just shellacked Blinken. He basically said, yeah, we have no respect for you guys. I mean, it's you guys who have been telling us that you're a racist, terrible country, so why would we take any moral advice from you? Which, by the way, shows why the left's words matter abroad. When you keep saying that America's a terrible, horrible, human rights violating place, turns out our enemies are noticing when you say that sort of stuff, that when you promulgate those sorts of lies. In any case, here was Joe Biden yesterday calling Vice President Kamala Harris President Harris. It's sad and a little gut churning at this point. I mean, when you watch Biden on tape, when you watch him give a speech, your heart's in your throat a little bit. I mean, he's still the president of the United States. He's still the elected president of the United States. I mean, not good stuff here.
Now, when President Harris and I took a virtual tour of a vaccination center in Arizona not long ago, one of the nurses on that tour, injecting people, giving vaccinations, said that each shot was like administering a dose of hope.
Yeah, again, he's not with it, guys, and it's a problem. It is a problem that he is not with it, especially because this administration is just generating crisis after crisis. They're going to generate a fiscal crisis. It is just a matter of time as to when that fiscal crisis materializes. Biden has the benefit, as I've been predicting for well over a year, of entering office at a time when the economy was in the toilet artificially because of all the COVID lockdown. So no matter what he did, the economy is going to boom. So now he stacks on top of that a bunch of unnecessary spending, plus a bunch of inflation, plus a bunch of tax increases. And it's only going to slow the economy slightly from the boom that it's been happening. Over time, however, those problems tend to materialize. Over time, the viral load becomes too large for the American economy. But Biden, as president, may not be around to feel it. And so Democrats aren't going to worry about that. Meanwhile, the crisis at the border is a very real crisis at the border. It is completely and solely driven by the rhetoric of Joe Biden. The policy has not changed. If the policy has changed, it's been liberalized. Jen Psaki made the crucial error yesterday of admitting that what was happening at the border was a crisis, which, of course, it is. We're holding over 13,000 children at the border in cages. I know we're not supposed to mention the sort of phraseology used so frequently by the Democrats for years, but that's what it is. If that's the kind of terminology you want to use, that's what it is. Here's Jen Psaki accidentally talking about the crisis at the border and then trying to walk it back.
There have been expectations set outside of, unrelated to any vaccine doses or requests for them, that they would be partners in dealing with the crisis on the border.
When you were talking a moment ago about diplomatic negotiations between the United States and Mexico, you said crisis on the border. Was that a
challenges on the border?
Okay, but so that doesn't reflect any change in the administration's view of things.
Nope.
Okay, so she screws up. She walks back. As long as she doesn't say it's a crisis, it's not a crisis, guys. We just, pretend along. Also, the most transparent administration in history continues to maintain they have no numbers for you. None. And the media just eat this up because it's the human centipede over there. Here is Jen Psaki saying they have no numbers. They clearly have numbers, by the way. If you think the government doesn't have numbers of the people they're actually keeping in the cages, that is utterly false. There's no way that is true. Here she was saying they have no numbers.
I'd be happy to provide you the numbers. I think CBP has the most up-to-date numbers, so I'd point you to them, and they provide those regularly. We'd certainly support that. I don't have them in front of me right now. I would say the message continues to be, now is not the time to come. The vast majority of families, of individuals, are sent back, are not welcomed across the border, and that's a message we will continue to convey clearly.
I don't have the numbers. CBP has the numbers. Wait, isn't CBP part of the executive branch? It's amazing how often Jen Psaki does this. You should go ask that department that I don't run from the White House, which is the head of the executive branch. And she says, now's not the time to come. Meanwhile, Alejandro Mayorkas, who's the head of the Department of Homeland Security, the administration is like, don't come right now, don't come right now. Mayorkas is like, also, if you have unaccompanied children, which is the crisis, by the way, right? We have no place to put these kids. They're coming without parents. I mean, it's the saddest thing in the world. I mean, these are children. These are children who are being sent across the border with coyotes in many cases, people who are not their parents. And then we're supposed to figure out what to do with them, which is, I mean, unless you are in an absolute life and death situation, that is an act of tremendous parental abdication. I have 3 kids who are under the age of 8. I have a 7, a 4, and a 1. The insanity of handing those kids over to any person who is not me, especially a professional smuggler, unless you're talking about, like, seriously, a life and death situation, I can't even imagine that. I can't even imagine that. Okay, but Mayorkas is encouraging it. Mayorkas says, if you do that, we will not expel them. If you do that, we will not try to find you and bring the kids back to you and by the way, put you at the back of the line and tell you can't come again. We're not going to do that. The administration is like, don't come right now. But also, if you send the kids by themselves, if you just send that 1-year-old toddling over the border with the, sex trafficking human coyote, then we'll take them. This is the head of Homeland Security, guys. I wonder why there's a crisis at the border.
Let me draw a distinction between families, if I may, and children who come without an adult. Some of these children are as young as 7, 8-year-old girls. And so we do not expel them back into the desert. But we say do not come because it is dangerous. But we well understand that out of desperation, some children might not wait. Some loving parents might send their child to traverse Mexico alone to reach the southern border, our southern border. I hope they don't undertake that perilous journey, but if they do, we will not expel that young child.
That's unbelievable. I mean, he's literally making excuses for parents doing this stuff. He's like, if a loving parent sends their 2-year-old with a human smuggler across the border, there are incentive structures here, gang. You can have nothing but sympathy for parents living in bad situations and kids living with their parents. But when you express the idea that these are heroes for sending their kids across the border and we're going to keep the kids here and they will get to live here. And then when they're in here, guess what they do? Family reunification programs. Right? You use your kid as the hook in order to get yourself in. And I have sympathy for people trying to get in the United States. It's a wonderful place to live. It's the greatest country in the world. Now, contrary to the left's opinion, America is actually pretty damn stellar. The same people who suggest that America is systemically racist, evil, filled with income inequality and greed are saying everybody should be able to come in here. Weird how people want to get in, since this is such an awful, terrible place. But to have the head of his job is the head of Homeland Security. He is not the empath in chief. He is the Homeland Security chief. His job is to make sure that our border is protected and that we don't have people who are unleashing waves of coyotes with small victimized children to the border. And he's encouraging it. I mean, this is active encouragement. Meanwhile, speaking of the corrupt relationship between the media and the Democratic Party, listen to how the Democratic Party are treating restrictions on the media. It's pretty astonishing. We'll get to that in just 1 second. First, spring is springing. It's the perfect reminder to tidy up and get your life in order. Why not start by protecting your family with life insurance? Policy Genius can help you compare top insurers in one place and save 50% or more. Once you find your best option, the Policy Genius team will set up your new policy for you and answer any questions you have along the way. Here's how you can get started. First, head on over to PolicyGenius.com. In minutes, you can work out how much coverage you need and compare quotes to find your best price. Policy Genius makes it easy to compare policies from as little as $15 a month. You might even be eligible to skip that in-person medical exam. Since their licensed agents work for you, not the insurance companies, there's no hassle. If you hit any speed bumps during the application process, Policy Genius will take care of everything soup to nuts. That kind of service has earned Policy Genius a 5-star rating across thousands of reviews on Trustpilot and Google. The best part? All the benefits of Policy Genius, the comparison tool, the handling of paperwork, the unbiased advice, totally free to use. So, while you are tidying up around the house this spring, why not get your life insurance organized as well? You could save 50% or more by comparing quotes. Feel good knowing if something happens, your loved ones will be taken care of. Go to PolicyGenius.com to get started. Policy Genius, when it comes to insurance, it's nice and quite important to get it right. Okay, so the Democrats are now saying, you know what? Sure, the Biden administration is not allowing members of the press in to actually see what the hell's going on. That's good. That's good. Remember, it was very bad when Trump wasn't fully transparent with the media. Now the Democrats are explicitly saying we're not going to let journalists in to these border facilities to take a look. By the way, where's AOC in all this? Just wondering. These were concentration camps. These concentration camps were so egregious, terrible, and evil that she traveled down to the border in an all-white outfit for a completely authentic, spontaneous, non-staged photo standing outside a chain link fence across a broad field from a detainment facility, and then cried directly into a camera. Where is she now? Oh, that's right. She's, back in her D.C. apartment with the Peloton bike. Yeah, that's what I thought. Here is Democratic Representative Linda Sanchez from California saying, you know what? Journalists should not see inside the facilities. We shouldn't have any idea what's going on inside those facilities.
These detention facilities at the border were not meant for children. Children are meant to be in licensed facilities, but because of the numbers and because of the social distancing that's required, they are doing the best that they can. And I don't necessarily think that it's appropriate for journalists to be inside centers that are not permanent places for children, that children are not placed there permanently. They're processed out of those facilities as quickly as possible and as quickly as the facilities will allow.
What does that have to do with whether the media gets to see what exactly is happening inside the facilities? The answer is Democrats don't want the pictures. They don't want the pictures. They want to attribute pictures during the Obama administration to Trump. And then they want to have no new pictures because of the overwhelm. Meanwhile, Julian Castro, former presidential candidate, he says, you know what? It's racist to ask about our immigration policies. We should not ask about immigration policies. That in and of itself is racism. Here's Joy Reid and Julian Castro going at it. A battle of the intellectual luminaries here on MSNBC.
This is part of their playbook. It's something that we've seen so many times before. It is fear-mongering. And this time, they're doing it because they can't argue with the Biden administration in terms of serving the needs of everyday Americans. So what do? They go to their red meat issue for their base, and they try and dehumanize these folks. Many times, a 12-year-old child, 16-year-old child that just is desperately trying to seek a better life.
I mean, you can't debate the issue or you're a racist. That is the way this debate always works. By the way, the House is now passing more immigration bills. The House passed a bill to give millions of so-called dreamers and farm workers a path to citizenship. So in the middle of a crisis, they're saying, you know what? Come on in. What do you think the set of incentives does? The reason they won't call it a crisis is because they like it. They want more of it. They want more people immigrating illegally to the United States. They don't want people to have to wait in line. They don't want there to have to be standards for immigration because they believe that these people are going to enter and then eventually are going to become Democratic voters. That's the only reason they're doing this, because otherwise they would want an orderly system. They clearly do not want an orderly system. They want to reward behavior that violates the law. I mean, they said openly that they want to make it not a crime to illegally cross the border. In a near party line vote of 228 to 197, the House first moved to set up a permanent legal pathway for more than 2.5 million undocumented immigrants, including those brought to the United States as children, and others granted temporary protected status for humanitarian reasons. 9 Republicans also voted yes. Hours later, lawmakers approved a second measure with more bipartisan backing that would eventually grant legal status to close to 1 million farm workers and their families while updating a key agricultural visa program. This time, 30 Republicans voted to join the Democrats in favor. Now, again, I'm not averse to saying that dreamers ought to be given some pathway to citizenship once we have shored up our border. But you cannot set up a magnet system inside the United States and not close the door at the same time. And that's what we're doing right now. This is what Ronald Reagan said after he passed the amnesty in 1986. He said, this is a great move. This will end illegal immigration. But he left the border wide open. So it didn't end illegal immigration. He said it was a major regret. Most Americans agree on this stuff, by the way. Immigration is like a 70-30 issue. Most Americans are pretty okay with legal immigration. They don't like illegal immigration. And they want to make sure that the people who are coming in are assimilating to the American way of life, believe in American values, and add to America's economic prosperity. You know how you do that? First, you close the borders. You make sure that people aren't just getting in. Second, you find all the people who are in the United States illegally, and you analyze whether they are, in fact, of net benefit to the United States, the same way you would de novo if somebody were attempting to immigrate to the United States. That's the way you do it. Democrats don't want to do it. They just want a wave. They just want as many people in here as possible who they think are going to vote for them. It's the same rationale behind why they want this so-called For the People Act. They want to overwhelm the system with the possibility of votes that cannot be verified, because that way they just win regardless. That is the goal. It's not to set up equal access to the ballot box, which already exists. Instead, what they want to do is essentially make it possible for the Democratic Party to go gather millions of votes via ballot harvesting and then just pack the ballot box for a bunch of people who weren't going to vote anyway. That's their actual goal here. Okay, we'll get to more of this in just 1 second, because the Democrats aren't stopping there, obviously. First, attention, savvy investors looking for predictable monthly cash flow. Is a 10% annualized immediate monthly payout good for starters? How about bonuses targeted to 21%? If you want the safety and security of a real estate investment, but without the hassle of being a landlord, you've probably heard of NRIA. NRIA is an industry-leading real estate development firm in its 15th year, developing strategically located, low-risk, high-demand neighborhoods based on supply-demand imbalance. They're a great fit for safety-oriented investors who want cash flow and diversification into carefully chosen real estate. Learn more about the NRIA Real Estate Development Fund at nria.net or call 800-800-1414. That is 800-800-1414. An offer of securities is only made by the NRIA Private Placement Memorandum. Read it first. Past performance does not guarantee future results. NRIA is a real estate development firm. Learn more at nria.net. Already coming up, the Democrats aren't just seeking to change the rules on immigration and voting. They also want to get rid of the filibuster so they can ram through anything they could possibly want. We'll bring you the latest. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. Welcome back. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. So many of the Democratic hopes for their legislative priorities rest in ramming through everything with 51 votes. Plus, Kamala Harris is the deciding vote. And those two Georgia Senate races mattered an awful lot. They mattered an awful lot. And if you stayed home in Georgia... Anyway, Joy Reid on MSNBC talked to Jen Psaki of the White House. How refreshing, Jen Psaki of the White House. And asked her, why aren't you just nuking the filibuster so you can ram through whatever you could possibly want?
Is bipartisanship in and of itself more important than passing voting rights, immigration reform, and, structurally changing things like the minimum wage? Is just bipartisanship in and of itself more important than those things?
Well, we don't see it exactly a choice like that. Obviously, he is not going to allow political games in Washington to hold his agenda hostage or prevent work being done on behalf of the American people.
Okay, so that is basically her saying, yeah, we'd consider screwing with the filibuster. And this is how Democrats see it, right? Progress can only be achieved if we screw with the process. Progress is the primary function of government, and progress is what we want. And we want it when we want it. And so we're going to do whatever we can to get it. And so now the House Democrats are looking to change the filibuster rules. The Senate Democrats as well. With an outright repeal of the filibuster unlikely, according to the New York Times, Democrats are turning to alternatives to bypass or weaken the 60-vote threshold in the Senate in order to ram through a landmark voting rights bill that many in the party now view as an existential necessity. Of course they view it as an existential necessity. We've talked many times over about H.R. 1, which they say, I love how the New York Times reports this. It's aimed at blunting Republican efforts to restrict ballot access. What Republican efforts to restrict ballot access? Voter ID? That is not a Republican effort to restrict ballot access. Presenting H.R. 1, which is the greatest violation of federalism that we have seen in modern American history. It literally takes all of the election procedures away from the states and localities and elevates them to the federal government, where the federal government sets the most permissive rules humanly possible on voting. That's literally bars the ability to check voter ID, prevents you from banning ballot harvesting, which is ballot harvesting is super corrupt. Ballot harvesting is you hire a bunch of Democratic operatives and they literally go door to door and they only go to Democrats and pick up their ballots, which doesn't guarantee equal access. In fact, it just means whoever has the better funded ground game, who can have the most cars picking up the most ballots, wins. The whole thing extends early voting. It provides for the ability to count votes after Election Day. I mean, it's an insane piece of legislation. Democrats want it specifically because they feel that it allows them to stack the ballot box as much as they could possibly want, and they can win elections that way. And this is why there's only one reason Democrats are doing that. It is not to shore up voter integrity or ballot access. That's not what this is about. So what are the Democrats trying to do? Well, now Stacey Abrams is suggesting that Democrats suspend the filibuster only for this one. just for this one. She says, yeah, you know what? Well, we're having a tough time getting rid of the filibuster overall, but on this one, it's just so important that we need it. So we'll only screw with the filibuster where we feel that we need to. Now, there's no limiting principle. If they want to pass Medicare for all in 1 second, they'll just screw with the filibuster on that too. Abrams says in an op-ed published by CNN, if Republican senators representing a minority of Americans attempt to thwart much-needed legislation to protect voting rights, Democrats should take bold action. Exempting legislation from a Senate filibuster is not unprecedented. And then, of course, she looked at things like the process by which the filibuster is suspended for budget bills. Yeah, there's a difference. If you don't pass a budget, the government goes bankrupt. Not quite the same thing here, Stacey. But again, the rules don't apply if you're a Democrat, and they shouldn't apply if you're a Democrat. So much so that you have senators, like the senator from New Mexico, Martin Heinrich, literally said that he wants to get rid of the filibuster. He's used it 350 times since 2014. Already coming up, we'll be talking with the author of what I think is the most important book of the last 5 years. This is The Ben Shapiro Show. Welcome back. This is The Ben Shapiro Show. Well, our society seems to be growing ever more bizarre. Today on Twitter, a person actually suggested that the term biological male ought to be banned when we are talking about trans people. That if you're a trans female, we are not allowed to say biological male. Because if you say biological male, then this is a form of discrimination. How exactly did we get to the point where it is now considered perceived wisdom by the masses that a male can become a female? Carl Trueman is the author of what I think is the most important book of the last 5 years, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. Carl, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Ben. Thanks for having me on.
So let's talk about the thesis of the book, which is essentially that a lot of what you're seeing in modern life, the sort of bizarre allegiance to ideas that confound reason and biology, and in some cases physics, because apparently if you're a transgender person, then not only are you a transgender person now, you were always that transgender person. So Bruce Jenner, when Bruce Jenner won medals at the Olympics, was actually a woman at the time, because all objective measures matter not. The only thing that matters is what Bruce Jenner what Caitlyn Jenner believes Caitlyn Jenner is. How did we get to this point? I think the thesis of your book is basically that this stuff is not self-creating. It's not like it just kind of came out of the ether and then just fully materialized. There's a long history that led to the point we are now at in society.
Yeah, that's very true. I think a lot of people are rightly, I suppose, or understandably mesmerized by the dramatic developments of the last few years. But actually, those developments stand on the back really of a much broader transformation in how human beings have understood themselves that goes back at least 300 or 400 years. And in essence, it's that we've slowly but surely come to prioritize and grant huge and even ultimate authority to feelings in a psychological space. What we're seeing at the moment is the outworking of that relative to sex, gender, etc. But it's nothing new. This prioritizing of inner feelings as fundamentally defining who we are. It's something you find back in Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century. It's something you find in the Romantics in the early 19th century. This is not a new thing. It's just that it's breaking out now in dramatic and popular ways that we have never really seen before and never anticipated.
So how did this come about? I mean, historically speaking, because it used to be, and it still is in traditional religious communities, that you recognize that your job as a parent is to take what is essentially an uncivilized small barbarian and turn them into a civilized human being. And anybody who's ever had small children understands that this is the case, that if you allowed your children to make their own decisions, they would be dead within just a couple of hours. And that is why it is your job as a parent to actually inculcate a respect for institutions, a respect for rules, and to help them adapt to the world around them. And it is that interaction between them and the world that defines who they are. It is not merely what they think they are that is reality, but we've moved away from that. So how did that movement happen?
Well, that's a very complicated story in many ways, but I think one significant dimension of that would be the breakdown of traditional structures of identity. When you think of certainly even the world that I grew up in the 70s and 80s, there was an assumption that society had a certain shape. There was the nation, there was the family, there were religious institutions, and these were bigger than the individual. And as you rightly point out, the task of education, the task of parenting was to teach the individual to fit into this larger pattern. I think what we've seen over the last 30, 40, 50 years is the steady collapse of those traditional structures of identity. And what's left, of course, is the individual. Why shouldn't my happiness be the primary focus of my life? Why should I think of my life as having a significance beyond my own immediate pleasure? We've really lost, I think, the ability to articulate the idea that each individual's purpose is actually to be found in something more social, something larger than the individual.
And that is it's such an interesting point, because one of the points that you make in the book, which is, again, is the rise and triumph of the modern self, one of the points that you make in the book is that we as a common society now only speak in that language, that even many of us who think that this sort of stuff is weird and strange and that the redefinition of individualism doesn't make a lot of sense, who believe that men are men and women are women, even we tend to speak in the language of what's been called expressive individualism, rather than the language of virtue and natural law that really characterized Western civilization for centuries.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, when you think about it, if you identify yourself as a straight person these days, you're buying into this idea that your identity is fundamentally your inner sexual desires, your inner sexual orientation. When you think of how many religious conservative people were raised no objection at all, or very little objection, and have learned to live with no-fault divorce. What is no-fault divorce? No-fault divorce is reflects a philosophy of marriage where the purpose of marriage is for the pleasure of the two contracting parties. The traditional view of marriage, of course, is that it's also to produce children, and it's to provide an environment for growing those children into, as you put it earlier on, members of society. No-fault divorce is a great example of how even religiously conservative people have bought into this idea that the meaning of life is me and my personal happiness in the here and now.
And this does create an awful lot of conflict, because if you are a person who believes that happiness relies in your subjective assessment of the world, and really it's the job of the world to conform to you, not the other way around, that you are going to change the world, right? Whatever you were born this way, in the words of Lady Gaga, and then now the rest of the world is its job is to confirm to you your perception of self. Then we now understand why it is that people get so angry when you say something that you think is tolerant, like do whatever you want, it's none of my business. They get angry when you say that, because that's not enough. What they require is not only your acceptance, but your approval. They require you to cheer on their self-identity. I think this is something conservatives never have understood, and your book clarified it for me, is why was there this shift from the argument, for example, on same-sex marriage, went from what we do behind our own closed doors is our business, which a lot of conservatives who don't like big government said, okay, well, that's at least a fair argument. It moved from that very quickly to, if you do not legitimize in every area of American life the complete sameness of same-sex marriage and traditional marriage, then you are somehow denying to me dignity. And as you talk about in the book, that keyword dignity has really become a fungible and useful term for folks on the political left.
Yes, very much so. And I think what you're pointing to there is it's a basic of human existence. We all want to be free. We intuitively understand ourselves as free beings, but we also want to belong. We want other people to acknowledge us for who we think we are. And that's what we're seeing today. And it's why freedom of religion is coming under huge pressure, because if you object religiously to gay marriage, what you're actually doing is objecting to the legitimacy of somebody else's identity. We see it on campuses with speech codes. If you offer a narrative or you express an opinion that calls into question somebody else's identity, then you are oppressing them. You are engaging in an act of psychological violence, as I've seen it portrayed. And one of the odd ironies of this, of course, is that you end up with a very sort of libertarian view of human identity feeding into a rather authoritarian type of government, in that somebody has to decide which identities are legitimate and which are not. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is you're a religious conservative, your identity is not legitimate.
So why is that? I mean, that really is the big question, because I think a lot of religious people as sort of a defense mechanism. They've said, all right, well, you want to live your life. Why can't you just let me live my life? Right? And so what we've had is, for example, in the law, Justice Gorsuch over the past term basically enshrined this philosophy in a law. He said that Civil Rights Act of 1965 is now going to encompass the idea of gender, not just sex. And now it's going to protect people who believe they are members of the opposite sex. But at the same time, we're going to have religious exemptions. So what this means is you can be bigoted, but only if you're a religious person. And people on the right tend to say, okay, well, so why can't they respect my way of life? I'm respecting your way of life. I'm leaving you alone. Why can't you just leave me alone? Why is it that religious identity remains maybe the only identity in American life that receives no dignity, no respect, and no level of hands-off control?
I think that, again, that's a complicated question, but I think part of the answer to that is less and less people in America are religious. And I think as you see the rise of the so-called nuns, as you see the rise of those who don't care one way or the other about religion, it becomes easier and easier for the anti-religious rhetoric to gain a hold in our society. I mean, you talk about Gorsuch last year, but we saw it in United States versus Windsor in 2013, which overthrew the Defense of Marriage Act, where essentially the Supreme Court said, if you object to gay marriage, you are an irrational bigot. You're engaging in constitutional animus. So this was not something invented by Justice Gorsuch in 2020. This is something, I think, that has been gaining a head of steam for some years now.
And as you point out, in terms of the Supreme Court lineage, when you look at the law, I mean, you can see it most clearly in that awful decision by Justice Kennedy in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, in which he talks about your right to define life and the meaning of the universe as you see fit, which is a very odd statement considering the universe has an objective reality all of its own.
Yes, and considering that the government has to constantly define who's a person and what the purpose of life is, that's why we have laws. Justice Kennedy, I think, is clearly a very intelligent man. He wouldn't be on the Supreme Court otherwise. But that statement is, there's no cure for stupid on that statement. That's a remarkable statement, I would say. Remarkable.
We'll get to more with Carl Trueman in just 1 second. First, why exactly are we choosing to give big tech companies our personal data? These people don't like you. They are not your friends. They want to monetize your data, and at the same time, they want to keep track of everything you're doing. Protect your personal data from big tech with the VPN I trust from my online protection, Expressive VPN. See, every device, whether you're on your phone, laptop, or TV, has a unique string of numbers called an IP address. When you search for stuff, watch videos, even click a link, big tech companies can use that IP to track all your activity and tie it back to you. When I use ExpressVPN, my connection gets rerouted through their secure encrypted servers, so these companies can't see my IP address at all. My internet activity becomes anonymized. My network data is encrypted. The best part? You don't need to be tech savvy at all to use ExpressVPN. Just download the app on your phone or computer, tap one button, and now you are protected. Protect your internet activity with the VPN I use every single day. Visit expressvpn.com/Ben to get 3 extra months for free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/Ben to get 3 extra months for free. expressvpn.com/Ben. Go check them out right now. expressvpn.com/Ben. Get 3 extra months free on that 1-year package. How exactly do we recover here? Because it seems like a lot of religious institutions themselves have completely foregone the battle. They've decided that their main job is to basically play guitar music and make you feel good about yourself. That spirituality with just a dash of God is going to be enough. That if we abandon all the rules, that's the only way to make people feel good about coming to church. That if you say things that are judgmental in any way, that this is going to alienate people. We actually saw this in Don Lemon this week on CNN declaring that the purpose of God, when the Catholic Church reaffirmed its view on same-sex relations, which has been the same for several thousand years at this point, and the entire media treated this as a shocking development, which is incredible. It's like breaking. Sky is blue, and we're all supposed to be shocked that the Catholic Church didn't change its doctrine that has been absolutely steady on this point for literally millennia. Don Lemon said, well, the Catholic Church should change its doctrine because God is non-judgmental, right? God is not a God who judges, which is literally the opposite of, the entire Bible, like all of it. The part that I believe, the part that you believe, and the part that, like the sequel, so it's a very bizarre statement, but there are a lot of churches that have bought into this and synagogues, a lot of religious institutions that have bought into the idea that the future of religion is basically in watering down religion so that it's secular humanism and you say Jesus sometimes.
Yeah, and that's a very tragic position to take. Relevance is a very cruel mistress when it comes to the religious world. And churches that seek relevance in that way, they simply lose their purpose, because the whole purpose of the church is to tell you, you're not okay the way you are. You need to commit to this. As soon as the church starts aping the world, guess what? The world does it a whole lot better. If you want to entertain people, I'd rather go to the theater or the cinema than go to a church to be entertained. So I think that the future for the church and for religious conservatives in general looks smaller. It looks less comfortable than it has been in the past. I don't see we have any choice. I do think we need to think strongly about building firm communities. If your strongest identity flows from the strongest community to which you belong to, then churches, synagogues, etc., they need to build strong communities, or they're not going to survive. And strong communities require distinctives. The LGBTQ plus movement teaches us that. They're strong and they survive because they were distinctive. Simply dissolving ourselves into the wider culture, that's suicide, that's spiritual suicide.
Now, do you think that there is a future for religion in the West, considering that this is now being brought to the legal level, that the conflict has not been relegated to the area of sort of social conflict and disagreement, but now it's being elevated to the point where companies are firing people for being religious, essentially, or for agreeing with religious views on particular, aspects of human nature? And by the way, not just religious views, natural law views, as you point out. There's a sort of bizarre safety that religious people feel that is the most unsafe position. When they say, oh, well, that's my religious view, they think that's like the most easy defense, but that's actually the worst defense, because then everybody immediately says, oh, yeah, that's just a cover for bigotry. So you don't make a natural law defense of your actual positions, and then you're accused of bigotry on that basis. But when everything is elevated to the HR department, when everything is elevated to the anti-discrimination law courts, when everything is elevated to federal law, is there a future for the ability to practice religion in the United States or abroad at all?
Humanly speaking, it's very bleak. Of course, in the part of the Bible, as I think you said, the sequel, or the bit that I believe in, we have promises that the gates of hell will not prevail. The church is always going to be around. And if Stalin couldn't wipe out orthodoxy in Russia, I find it very hard to believe that Biden and Harris are going to be able to wipe out Christianity in America. Having said that, I think the immediate future is much darker than the past. And there are going to be significant challenges. I have the privilege of teaching at a Christian college. Many of my friends teach in the secular and work in the secular workplace. It's much tougher for them now, and I'm sure it will be coming to Christian colleges as well in the future. So I'm very sober about the immediate future, optimistic, I think, about the long term.
Well, the book is a must-read. It is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. Carl Trueman. He is a biblical and religious studies professor over at Grove City College. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much for having me on, Ben.
All righty, coming up, we're going to talk about some of the latest beauties of our modern culture, including Drag Queen Story Hour, which, of course, is one of the just great blessings with which we have been granted. Well, we'll get to that in just 1 second. First, whether you're an avid news watcher or in serious need of a distraction, unplugging yourself is easier said than done. When I want to rest my eyes and still get the content I'm looking for, I put in my Raycon wireless earbuds and I listen to something amazing. Raycons are built to perform anywhere, anytime with water and sweat-resistant construction, Bluetooth that pairs quickly and seamlessly. With enough battery life for 6 hours of playtime, you can unplug for quite a while. Raycons come in a range of stylish colors with a comfortable in-ear fit for a more discreet look. The best part? Raycon makes great sound accessible to everyone with wireless earbuds starting at half the price of other premium audio brands. Raycon is offering 15% off all their products for my listeners. Here's what you need to do to get it. Go to buyraycon.com/Ben. That is 15% off at BUYRAYCON.com/Ben. Buyraycon.com/Ben. Go check them out right now. Buyraycon.com/Ben. Get 15% off. When you do, Raycons are great. They fit my ear perfectly because you can customize them to fit your ear perfectly, and they're not going to cost you an arm and a leg. Go to buyraycon.com/Ben. Get 15% off today. That is buyraycon.com/Ben. Alrighty, coming up, some breaking news on one of the founders of Drag Queen Story Hour. This should not shock you, but it might. This is The Ben Shapiro Show. Welcome back. This is The Ben Shapiro Show. Well, we now know, according to Ian Hayworth over at Daily Wire, the mayor of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett, is reportedly expressing his complete surprise that child court judge Brett Blom who, quote, previously headed up an LGBTQ organization that fundraised for Drag Queen Story Hour, among other programs, was arrested on tentative charges of possession of child pornography. Who? No. You mean people who raise money for events in which drag queens, which are sexualized performers, perform for small children in drag? That those people might be sexualizing children? No. I can't believe it. As reported by the Daily Wire, the Wisconsin Department of Justice reportedly began an investigation into Blom after receiving a tip through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, according to the complaint, which also alleges that Blom shared child pornography with other Kik users through private chats and messaging groups on 27 separate occasions. The complaint lists descriptions of the videos, which are both graphic and disturbing. Some of the videos involve toddlers and other very young children. Brett Blom was taken into custody by special agents with the State Division of Criminal Investigation, according to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. The mayor said, these are a complete surprise, these allegations. Well, it's not like such a complete surprise, is it? Drag Queen Story Hour, which the organization led by Blom described as, quote, capturing the imagination and play of the gender fluidity of childhood and gives kids glamorous, positive, and unabashedly queer role models, is itself part of an open effort to sexualize children, of course. One shocking example was reported by the Daily Wire in October 2019, after photos showed a drag queen performer named Sasha Soto repeatedly exposing himself while reading to young children during a recent Drag Queen Story Hour event at a taxpayer-funded library in Minnesota. But it's not just that. In 2019, the Houston Public Library admitted they allowed a convicted sex offender to read to children as young as 2 after failing to perform a basic background check. The man had previously been charged for sexually assaulting a child who was 8 at the time. Another registered sex offender was reportedly found to have participated in the Space City Sisters, another Drag Queen Story Hour troupe in Houston. Let me be perfectly frank about this. It is not just the people who made up Drag Queen Story Hour who have a problem. It is any parents who would put their kids in proximity with these folks. What are you doing as a parent? What are you doing as a parent? Why are you putting your kids in proximity to sexualized performers of any sort? Are you an insane person? Why would you do this? Unless you wish to propagandize to your child about the fluidity of gender. Unless that's the actual goal. Which presumably it is. Because there is no other reason not to protect the innocence of your children. I'm not surprised by the activity of the people who are involved in, some of the people involved in these Drag Queen Story Hours. But I will never get over being surprised by the willingness of parents to subject their children to the insanity of this stuff, to the sexualization of this stuff. I am a parent. I have 3 young children. The notion of exposing my children to anything remotely like this is so far beyond the realm of the rational that if I had my way, if I had my druthers, Child Protective Services would be called on parents who bring their kids to sexualized drag queens gyrating in front of 3-year-olds. That is child endangerment. What an insane society. But don't worry, that's actually liberation. If you read the kids' Dr. Seuss, then you've really screwed up the kids. If they read If I Ran the Zoo, you never know what might happen. They might travel to the African island of Yurka and find a mazurka. These are very, very difficult problems for small children. Clearly, If I Ran the Zoo and Mulberry Street, that's the threat to your kids. Not having over-sexualized men dressed as women gyrating and thrusting their pelvises in front of your children. Yeah, our society might be toast. It might be over, gang. Last one out, turn out the lights. Alrighty, we'll be back here next week. Try not to wreck everything over the weekend worse than it already is. And we'll be back here on Monday to recap all of it. I'm Ben Shapiro. This is The Ben Shapiro Show.